Section 12 of The Story of the Trapper by Agnes Christina Laut. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Leinhardt. Chapter 12. Baptiste, the Bear Hunter. The city man who goes bear hunting with a bodyguard of armed guides in a field where the hunted have been on the run from the hunter for a century gets a very tame idea of the natural bear in its natural state. Bears that have had the fear of man inculcated with long-range repeaters lose confidence in the prowess of an aggressive onset against invisible foes. The city man comes back from the wilds with a legend of how harmless bears have become. In fact, he doesn't believe a wild animal ever attacks unless it is attacked. He doubts whether the bear would go on its lifelong career of rapine and death if hunger did not compel it, or if repeated assault and battery from other animals did not teach the poor bear the art of self-defense. Grizzly old trappers coming down to the frontier towns of the western states once a year for provisions, or hanging round the forts of the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada for the summer, tell a different tale. Their hunting is done in a field where human presence is still so rare that it is unknown, and the bear treats mankind precisely as he treats other living beings, from the moose and the muskox to mice and ants, as fair game for his own insatiable maw. Old hunters may be great spinners of yarns, liars, the city man calls them, but Montaigne, who squats on his heels round the fur company forts on Peace River, carries ocular evidence in the artificial ridge of a deformed nose that the bear which he slew was a real one with an Epicurean relish for that part of Indian anatomy which the Indian considers to be the most choice bit of a moose. And the Kootenai hunter, who was sent through the forests of Idaho to follow up the track of a lost brave, brought back proof of an actual bear, for he found a dead man lying across a pile of logs with his skull crushed in like an eggshell by something that had risen swift and silent from a lair on the other side of the logs and dealt the climbing brave one quick, terrible blow. And little blind Baptiste, wizened and old, who spent the last 20 years of his life weaving grass mats and carving curious little wooden animals for the children of the chief factor, could convince you that the bears he slew in his young days were very real bears, altogether different from the clumsy Bruins that gambol with boys and girls through fairy books. That is, he could convince you if he would, for he usually sat weaving and weaving at the grasses, weaving bitter thoughts into the woof of his mat, without a word. Round his white helmet, such as British soldiers wear in hot lands, he always hung a heavy, thick linen thing like the frill of a sunbonnet, coming over the face as well as the neck. To keep the sun off, he would mumble out if you asked him why. More than that of the mysterious frill worn on dark days as well as sunny, he would never vouch unless some town-bred man patronizingly pooh-poohed the dangers of bear hunting. Then the grass strands would tremble with excitement, and the little French hunter's body would quiver, and he would begin pouring forth a jumble, half habitant, half Indian, with a mixture of all the oaths from both languages, pointing and pointing at his hidden face, and bidding you look what the bear had done to him, but never lifting the thick frill. It was somewhere between the tributary waters that flow north to the Saskatchewan and the rivers that start near the Saskatchewan to flow south to the Missouri. Baptiste and the 3 trappers who were with him did not know which side of the boundary they were on. By slow travel, stopping one day to trap beaver, pausing on the way to forage for meat, building their canoes where they needed them, and abandoning the boats when they made a long overland portage, they were 3 weeks north of the American fur post on the banks of the Missouri. The hunters were traveling light-handed. That is, they were carrying only a little salt and tea and tobacco. For the rest, they were depending on their muskets. Game had not been plentiful. Between the prairie and the mountains of the setting sun, as the Indians call the Rockies, a long line of tortuous, snaky red crawled sinuously over the crests of the foothills, and all game, bird and beast, will shun a prairie fire. There was no wind. It was the dead, hazy calm of Indian summer in the late autumn, with the sun swimming in the purplish smoke like a blood-red shield all day, and the serpent line of flame flickering and darting little tongues of vermilion against the deep blue horizon all night. Days filled with the crisp smell of withered grasses, nights as clear and cold as the echo of a bell. On a windless plain, there is no danger from a prairie fire. One may travel for weeks without nearing or distancing the waving tide of fire against a far sky, and the 4 trappers, running short of rations, decided to try to flank the fire coming around far enough ahead to intercept the game that must be moving away from the fire line. Nearly all hunters, through some dexterity of natural endowment, unconsciously become specialists. One man sees beaver signs where another sees only deer. For Baptiste, the page of nature spelled B-E-A-R. 15 bear in a winter is a wonderfully good season's work for any trapper. Baptiste's record for one lucky winter was 54. After that, he was known as the bear hunter. Such a reputation affects keen hunters differently. The Indian grows cautious, almost to cowardice. Baptiste grew rash. He would follow a wounded grizzly to cover. He would afterward laugh at the episode as a joke if the wounded brute had treed him. "For sure, good ting dat was not de prairie dat time," he would say, flinging down the pelt of his foe. The other trappers with Indian blood in their veins might laugh, but they shook their heads when his back was turned. Flanking the fire by some of the great gullies that cut the foothills like trenches, the hunters began to find the signs they had been seeking. For Baptiste, the many different signs had but one meaning. Where some summer rain pool had dried almost to a soft mud hole, the other trappers saw little cleft footmarks that meant deer, and prints like a baby's fingers that spelled out the visit of some member of the weasel family, and broad splay hoof impressions that had spread under the weight as some giant moose had gone shambling over the quaking mud bottom. But Baptiste looked only at a long, shuffling footmark the length of a man's forearm, with padded, ball-like pressures as of monster toes. The French hunter would at once examine which way that great foot had pointed. Were there other impressions, dimmer on the dry mud? Did the crushed speargrass tell any tales of what had passed that mud hole? If it did, Baptiste would be seen wandering apparently aimlessly out on the prairie, carrying his uncased rifle carefully that the sunlight should not glint from the barrel, zigzagging up a foothill where perhaps wild plums or shrub berries hung rotting with frost ripeness. Baptiste did not stand full height at the top of the hill. He dropped face down, took off his hat or scarlet safety handkerchief, and peered warily over the crest of the hill. If he went on over into the next valley, the other men would say they guessed he smelt bear. If he came back, they knew he had been on a cold scent that had faded indistinguishably as the grasses thinned. Southern slopes of prairie and foothill are often matted tangles of a raspberry patch. Here Baptiste read many things, stories of many bears, of families, of cubs, of old cross fellows wandering alone. Great slabs of stone had been clawed up by mighty hands. Worms and snails and all the damp, clammy things that cling to the cold dark between stone and earth had been gobbled up by some greedy forager. In the trenched ravines crossed by the trappers lay many a hidden forest of cottonwood or poplar or willow. Here was refuge, indeed, for the wandering creatures of the treeless prairie that rolled away from the tops of the cliffs. Many secrets could be read from the clustered woods of the ravines. The other hunters might look for the fresh nibbled alder bush where a busy beaver had been laying up store for winter, or detect the blink of a russet ear among the seared foliage betraying a deer, or wonder what flesh-eater had caught the poor jackrabbit just outside his shelter of thorny brush. The hawk, soaring and dropping, lilting and falling and lifting again, might mean that a little mink was playing dead to induce the bird to swoop down so that the vampire beast could suck the hawk's blood, or that the hawk was watching for an unguarded moment to plunge down with his talons in a poor fool hen's feathers. These things might interest the others. They did not interest Baptiste. Baptiste's eyes were for layers of grass crushed so recently that the spear leaves were even now rising, for holes in the black mold where great ripping claws had been tearing up roots, for hollow logs and rotted stumps where a black bear might have crawled to take his afternoon siesta, for punky trees which a grizzly might have torn open to gobble ants' eggs, for scratchings down the bole of poplar or cottonwood where some languid bear had been sharpening his claws in midsummer as a cat will scratch chair legs, for great pits deep in the clay banks where some silly badger or gopher ran down to the depths of his burrow in sheer terror, only to have old Bruin come ripping and tearing to the innermost recesses with scattered fur left that told what had happened. Some soft, oozy, moss-padded lair deep in the marsh with the reeds of the brittle cattails lifting as if a sleeper had just risen, sets Baptiste's pulse hopping, jumping, marking time in thrills like the lithe bounds of a pouncing mountain cat. With tread soft as the velvet paw of a panther, he steals through the canebrake, parting the reeds before each pace, brushing aside softly, silently, what might crush, snap, sound ever so slight an alarm to the little pricked ears of a shaggy head tossing from side to side. Jerk, jerk, from right to left, from left to right, always on the listen, for prey, for prey. Oh, for sure, that Baptiste, he was but a fool hunter, as his comrades afterward said. It is always so very plain afterward. That Baptiste, he was a fool. What man else goes step, step into the marsh after a bear? But the truth was that Baptiste, the cunning rascal, always succeeded in coming out of the marsh, out of the bush, out of the windfall, sound as a top, safe and unscratched, with a bearskin over his shoulder, the head swinging pendant to show what sort of fellow he had mastered. That one, ah, diable, his long, sharp nose. He was thin, thin as a barrel, all gone, but the hoops, ah, voila, he was one ugly garçon, was that bear. Where the hunters found tufts of fur on the sagebrush, bits of skin on the spined cactus, the others might vow coyotes had worried a badger. Baptiste would have it that the badger had been slain by a bear. The cached carcass of fawn or doe, of course, meant bear, for the bear is an epicure that would have meat gamey. To that the others would agree. And so the shortening autumn days, with the shimmering heat of a crisp noon and the noiseless chill of starry twilights, found the trappers canoeing leisurely upstream from the northern tributaries of the Missouri, nearing the long overland trail that led to the hunting fields in Canada. One evening they came to a place bounded by high cliff banks, with the flats heavily wooded by poplar and willow. Baptiste had found signs that were hot, oh, so hot. The mold of an uprooted gopher hole was so fresh that it had not yet dried. This was not a region of timber wolves. What had dug that hole? Not the small, skulking coyote, the vagrant of prairie life. Oh, no. The coyote, like other vagrants, earns his living without work by skulking in the wake of the businesslike badger. And when the badger goes down in the gopher hole, Master Coyote stands nearby and gobbles up all the stray gophers that bolt to escape the invading badger. What had dug the hole? Baptiste thinks that he knows. That was on open prairie. Just below the cliff is another kind of hole, a roundish pit dug between moss-covered logs and earth wall, a pit with grass clawed down into it, snug and hidden and sheltered as a bird's nest. If the pit is what Baptiste thinks, somewhere on the banks of the stream should be a watering place. He proposes that they beach the canoes and camp here. Twilight is not a good time to still hunt an unseen bear. Twilight is the time when the bear himself goes still hunting. Baptiste will go out in the early morning. Meantime, if he stumbles on what looks like a trail to the watering place, he will set a trap. Camp is not for the regular trapper what it is for the amateur hunter, a time of rest and waiting while others skin the game and prepare supper. One hunter whittles the willow sticks that are to make the camp fire. Another gathers moss or boughs for a bed. If fish can be got, someone has out a line. The kettle hisses from the crossbar between notched sticks above the fire, and the meat sizzling at the end of a forked twig sends up a flavor that whets every appetite. Over the upturned canoes bend a couple of men gumming afresh all the splits and seams against tomorrow's voyage. Then, with a flip-flop that tells of the other side of the flapjacks being browned, the cook yodels in crescendo that supper is ready. Supper over, a trap or two may be set in likely places. The men may take a plunge, for in spite of their tawny skins, these earth-colored fellows have closer acquaintance with water than their appearance would indicate. The man smell is as acute to the beast's nose as the rank fur animal smell is to the man's nose, and the first thing that an Indian who has had a long run of ill luck does is to get a native sweating bath and make himself clean. On the ripple of the flowing river are the red bars of the campfire. Among the willows, perhaps, the bole of some birch stands out white and spectral. Though there is no wind, the poplars shiver with a fall of wan, faded leaves like snowflakes on the grave of summer. Red bills and whiskey jacks and lonely phoebe birds came fluttering and pecking at the crumbs. Out from the gray thicket bounds a cottontail to jerk up on his hind legs with surprise at the campfire. A blink of his long ear, and he is bounded back to tell the news to his rabbit family. Overhead, with shrill clangor, single file and in long wavering V-lines, winged geese migrating southward for the season. The children's hour, as a great poet called a certain time of day, then this is the hour of the wilderness hunter, the hour when the mountains of the setting sun are flooded in fiery lights from zone to zenith, with the snowy heights overtopping the far rolling prairie like clouds of opal at poise in mid-heaven, the hour when the campfire lies on the russet autumn-tinged earth like a red jewel, and the far line of the prairie fire billows against the darkening east in a tide of vermilion flame. Unless it is raining, the voyageurs do not erect their tent, for they will sleep in the open, feet to the fire, or under the canoes, close to the great earth, into whose very fiber their beings seem to be rooted. And now is the time when the hunters spin their yarns and exchange notes of all they have seen in the long, silent day. There was the prairie chicken with a late brood of half-grown, clumsy, clucking chicks, amply able to take care of themselves, but still clinging to the old mother's care. When the hunter came suddenly on them, over the old hen went, flopping, broken-winged, to decoy the trapper till her children could run for shelter, when, lo, of a sudden, the broken wing is mended, and away she darts on both wings before he has uncased his gun. There are the stories of bear hunters like Baptiste sitting on the other side of the fire there, who have been caught in their own bear traps and held till they died of starvation and their bones bleached in the rusted steel. That story has such small relish for Baptiste that he hitches farther away from the others and lies back flat on the ground, close to the willow undertangle, with his head on his hand. For sure, says Baptiste contemptuously, nobody doesn't need no tree to climb here. Sacre, cry wolf, wolf. and for sure, diable, the big loup-garou will eat you yet. Down somewhere from those stars overhead drops a call silvery as a flute, clear as a piccolo, some night bird lilting like a mote on the far oceans of air. The trappers look up with a movement that in other men would be a nervous start, for any shrill cry pierces the silence of the prairie in almost a stab. Then the men go on with their yarn, telling of how the Blackfeet murdered some traders on this very ground not long ago, till the gloom gathering over willow thicket and encircling cliffs seems peopled with those marauding warriors. One man rises, saying that he is going to turn in, and is taking a step through the dark to his canoe when there is a dull, pouncing thud. For an instant the trappers thought that their comrade had stumbled over his boat. But a heavy groan, a low guttural cry, a shout of "Help! Help! Help! Baptiste!" and the man who had risen plunged into the crashing canebrake, calling out incoherently for them to "Help! Help Baptiste!" In the confusion of cries and darkness, it was impossible for the other two trappers to know what had happened. Their first thought was of the Indians whose crimes they had been telling. Their second was for their rifles, and they had both sprung over the fire when they saw the third man striking wildly at something in the dark. A low, worrying growl, and they descried the Frenchman rolling over and over, clutched by or clutching a huge furry form, hitting, plunging with his knife, struggling, screaming with agony. "It's Baptiste! It's a bear!" shouted the third man, who was attempting to drive the brute off by raining blows on its head. Man and bear were an indistinguishable struggling mass. Should they shoot in the half-dark? Then the Frenchman uttered the scream of one in death throes. "Shoot! Shoot! Shoot quick! She's striking my face! She's striking my face!" And before the words had died, sharp flashes of light cleft the dark. The great beast rolled over with a coughing growl, and the trappers raised their comrade from the ground. The bear had had him on his back, between her teeth, by the thick chest-piece of his double-breasted buckskin. Except for his face, he seemed uninjured, but down that face the great brute had drawn the claws of her forepaw. Baptiste raised his hands to his face. "Mon Dieu," he asked thickly, fumbling with both hands, "what is done to my eyes? Is the fire out? I cannot see." Then the man who had fought like a demon, armed with only a hunting knife, fainted because of what his hands felt. Traitors there are among trappers, as among all other classes, men like those who deserted Glass on the Missouri and Scott on the Platte, and how many others whose treachery will never be known. But Baptiste's comrades stayed with him on the banks of the river that flows into the Missouri. One cared for the blind man. The other two foraged for game. When the wounded hunter could be moved, they put him in a canoe and hurried downstream to the fur post before the freezing of the rivers. At the fur post, the doctor did what he could, but a doctor cannot restore what has been torn away. The next spring, Baptiste was put on a pack horse and sent to his relatives at the Canadian fur post. Here his sisters made him the curtain to hang round his helmet and set him to weaving grass mats, that the days might not drag so wearily. Ask Baptiste whether he agrees with the amateur hunter that bears never attack unless they are attacked, that they would never become ravening creatures of prey unless the assaults of other creatures taught them ferocity. Ask Baptiste this, and something resembling the snarl of a baited beast breaks from the lipless face under the veil. "Sss!" with a quiver of inexpressible rage. "The bear, it is an animal. The bear, it is a beast. Toujours. The bear, it is a beast. Always, always." And his hands clench. Then he falls to carving of the little wooden animals and weaving of sad, sad, bitter thoughts into the warp of the Indian mat. Are such onslaughts common among bears, or are they the mad freaks of the bear's nature? President Roosevelt tells of 2 soldiers bitten to death in the Southwest, and Monsieur l'Abbé Dugas of St. Boniface, Manitoba, incidentally relates an experience almost similar to that of Baptiste, which occurred in the Northwest. Lest Baptiste's case seems overdrawn, I quote the abbé's words. Quote, "At a little distance, Madame la Gimonet and the other women were preparing the tents for the night, when all at once Bouvier gave a cry of distress and called to his companions to help him. At the first shout, each hunter seized his gun and prepared to defend himself against the attack of an enemy. They hurried to the other side of the ditch to see what was the matter with Bouvier and what he was struggling with. They had no idea that a wild animal would come near the fire to attack a man even under cover of night, for fire usually has the effect of frightening wild beasts. However, almost before the 4 hunters knew what had happened, they saw their unfortunate companion dragged into the woods by a bear, followed by her 2 cubs. She held Bouvier in her claws and struck him savagely in the face to stun him. As soon as she saw the 4 men in pursuit, she redoubled her fury against her prey, tearing his face with her claws. Monsieur la Gimonet, who was an intrepid hunter, baited her with the butt end of his gun to make her let go her hold, as he dared not shoot for fear of killing the man while trying to save him. But Bouvier, who felt himself being choked, cried with all his strength, "Shoot! I would rather be shot than eaten alive." Monsieur la Gimonet pulled the trigger as close to the bear as possible, wounding her mortally. She let go Bouvier, and before her strength was exhausted, made a wild attack upon Monsieur la Gimonet, who expected this, and as his gun had only 1 barrel loaded, he ran towards the canoe, where he had a 2nd gun fully charged. He had hardly seized it before the bear reached the shore and tried to climb into the canoe. But fearing no longer to wound his friend, Monsieur la Gimonet aimed full at her breast, and this time she was killed instantly. As soon as the bear was no longer to be feared, Madame la Gimonet, who had been trembling with fear during the tumult, went to raise the unfortunate Bouvier, who was covered with wounds and nearly dead. The bear had torn the skin from his face with her nails, from the roots of his hair to the lower part of his chin. His eyes and nose were gone. In fact, his features were indiscernible, but he was not mortally injured. His wounds were dressed as well as the circumstances would permit, and thus crippled, he was carried to the fort of the prairies, Madame la Gimonet taking care of him all through the journey. In time, his wounds were successfully healed, but he was blind and infirm to the end of his life. He dwelt at the fort of the prairies for many years, but when the first missionaries reached Red River in 1818, he persuaded his friends to send him to St. Boniface to meet the priests, and ended his days in Monsieur Provencher's house. He employed his time during the last years of his life in making crosses and crucifixes, blind as he was, but he never made any chefs d'oeuvre. Such is bear hunting, and such is the nature of the bear. And these things are not of the past. Wherever long-range repeaters have not put the fear of man in the animal heart, the bear is the aggressor. Even as I write comes word from a little frontier fur post, which I visited in 1901, of a 7-year-old boy being waylaid and devoured by a grizzly only 4 miles back from a transcontinental railway. This is the 2nd death from the unprovoked attacks of bears within a month in that country. And that month, the month of August 1902, when sentimental ladies and gentlemen many miles away from danger are sagely discussing whether the bear is naturally ferocious or not, whether, in a word, it is altogether humane to hunt bears. End of section 12.